She refused the Alpha King's mark before everyone. The entire royal pack turned against their king fast. Sarah Vance had counted the torches 3 years ago, standing in this same hall, watching her sister walk toward the king with shaking hands. 14 torches. She had counted them to keep herself from crying. There were still 14. The hall was the largest room in the royal pack's stone palace. The ceiling climbed so high that the upper corners lived in shadow. Every alpha, elder, and noble of the Drath Kingdom had gathered tonight, dressed in dark colors, standing in neat rows like they had been placed there. Candles burned on long tables. Silk banners with the silver Drath crest hung from iron rods. Sarah walked down the center aisle alone. The guard who had escorted her to the door had called it an honor. She had nodded once and said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. She had been practicing for years. King Calum Drath stood at the far end of the hall on a raised stone platform. He was tall. He was the kind of face that made people stop talking mid-sentence. Dark eyes, a jaw cut like he had been made on purpose, by someone with strong opinions. He wore no crown tonight. He did not need one. He watched her walk toward him with the same expression he probably used when reviewing maps of land he intended to acquire. Sarah kept her eyes on his. She kept counting in her head, not torches this time, breaths. She stopped 5 feet from him. The ceremony was short by design. The Alpha King's marking ceremony was not meant to be a conversation. It was meant to be a declaration. He would speak. She would kneel. He would place his mark on her neck, binding her to him as his chosen mate and queen. The pack would witness. The pack would bow. That was how it had always worked. Calum's voice filled the hall without effort. He spoke about fate, about the bond between an alpha and his chosen mate, about how she, Sarah Vance, had been selected above all others, raised from nothing to stand beside a king, given a name and a crown and a future she could not have built alone. He spoke about it beautifully. He had clearly done this before. Her sister's face appeared in her mind, uninvited. Her sister, 3 years ago, in a dress like this one. Her sister, who had not refused. Her sister, who now lived in a wing of the palace she had not chosen, with a mark on her neck she had not asked for, and who had not once, in 3 years, been heard to laugh. Calum finished speaking. He extended his hand to her. The hall waited. Sarah looked at his hand for a moment, then she looked up at his face. "No," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was not shaking. It landed in the hall the way a stone lands in still water. Quiet drop, wide ring. Calum's hand stayed extended. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted fast and then went flat. Sarah. His voice was a warning wrapped in a name. "No," she said again. Not louder, more settled, like the word had found the ground under it. The silence in the hall had texture. It was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of 400 people holding the same breath. Calum lowered his hand slowly. He looked at her with full attention for the first time that night. Not like a map now, like a problem he had not anticipated and did not yet know how to solve. She turned. She walked back down the center aisle. Her footsteps were even. Her back was straight. Every pair of eyes in the hall tracked her, but not one hand reached out, not one voice called out, and the guards at the entrance doors did not move to stop her, because Calum had not told them to. She pushed the doors open herself. The sound of them swinging shut behind her traveled back through the hall and settled over the crowd like a held note that had finally been released. Inside, the hall stayed silent for 3 full seconds. Then Elder Marin sat down. She did it slowly, without drama, the way a woman sits when her knees decide before her mind does. She was 81 years old and had served 4 kings. She sat down in the middle of a standing ceremony and folded her hands in her lap and looked at nothing in particular. No one looked directly at her, but every alpha in that room registered it, the way a wolf registers a shift in wind before the storm arrives. Calum's voice came out, 1/2 beat slower than it should have, when he told the hall the ceremony was concluded for the evening. The pack began to move, quietly, without the usual noise of celebration. Lorne, the king's beta and closest advisor for 16 years, walked beside Calum toward the private corridor. Calum asked him, without looking at him, what he thought. Lorne walked 2 more steps before answering. "I think she was right, my king." He said nothing else. He did not look away. He kept walking at the same pace, as if he had said something about the weather. Calum stopped walking. Lorne kept going. The hours that followed were not loud. There was no fire, no march, no declaration of war against the crown. What happened instead was quieter and harder to contain. Alpha Renwick sent a formal request for a private audience, citing a land matter that had been, in his words, unresolved for 8 years. 2 noble families sent their regrets for the evening feast, with polite explanations that said nothing and meant everything. In the lower halls, conversations that had lived in locked rooms for years began moving through open corridors. Sarah, meanwhile, sat in the small room at the eastern edge of Pack territory where she had been housed before the ceremony. She still had the dress on. She had not taken it off yet, not because she could not move, but because she was not finished yet, and was not entirely sure what finished looked like. The 14 torches stayed in her head, her sister's face. The way her sister had walked back out of that hall 3 years ago, with her chin up and her eyes on the floor, and how those 2 things together had told Sarah everything that words had not. She had not planned tonight perfectly. She had not planned it much at all, if she was honest. What she had done was make a decision 3 weeks ago, very quietly, when the invitation, which was not an invitation but a selection, had arrived. She had sat with it for 20 minutes. Then she had folded it in half and set it on the table, and thought about her sister's laugh, which she had not heard in 3 years. Then the 20 minutes had ended, and she had known. Midnight. A knock on her door that did not wait for an answer. Calum Drath filled the doorway. He was not in ceremony clothes now. He wore plain dark gray. His expression was controlled, but not all the way controlled, like a lid on something that had been boiling for several hours. He told her what she had done. He told her she had fractured his council, destabilized his rule, and placed a public humiliation on the crown of the Drath kingdom that would take years to address. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him one question. "What does your name mean to my sister?" The room went very quiet. He said nothing. She looked at him steadily. "I will answer everything you came here to ask. I will tell you exactly why I refused, and what I want, and what I think should happen next. When you can answer that question." Calum stood in her doorway for a long moment. Then he left. The door stayed open behind him, which was worse, in some way she could not fully explain, than if he had slammed it. She listened to his footsteps move down the stone corridor until she could not hear them anymore. Then she looked at the wall across from her, which was bare stone and had nothing to offer. She thought about her sister. She thought about the moment in the hall when her own voice had said no, and the word had landed, and the air had changed. She did not feel powerful. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had been holding a breath for 3 years, and had finally, in one moment before an audience of 400, let it out. The air was different now. She was not yet sure if different was the same as safe. Over the 3 days that followed, what shifted in the royal pack was not loyalty towards Sarah. She held no title, no bloodline worth speaking of in that hall, no claim to leadership. What shifted was something older and less dramatic. It was the pack's relationship with its own silence. 3 formal grievances were filed with the council, the first in 11 years. Elder Marin quietly moved to chair a review of pack resource allocation that had been tabled since the previous king's reign. 2 alphas who had not spoken to each other publicly in 6 years were seen in the same corridor, speaking in low voices, for a very long time. Calum did not stop any of it. Whether he could not, or would not, was a question no one could answer with certainty, and the uncertainty itself was a kind of answer. He did not come back to her door. On the 4th morning, Sarah finally took the dress off. She folded it carefully and set it on the wooden chair by the window. The fabric was expensive. She had not chosen it, but she had worn it through the hardest and most honest night of her life, and it had held up, and so she folded it with something close to respect. She put on her own clothes, plain, dark, hers. She opened the door and walked out into the corridor, and the morning light came through the stone window at the far end of it, and the pack grounds were already moving below, full of ordinary sounds: wolves training, someone calling across the yard, a gate swinging open. She did not know yet what came next. She knew what she had said. She knew it had been heard. For now, that was enough to walk on,